Cullman County, Alabama, September 15, 1979. The smell of fresh hay and diesel fuel hung heavy in the air as Marcus Thompson guided his Ford pickup down the gravel road toward the Henderson farm. At 23, Marcus had the kind of steady reliability that made him indispensable to farmers throughout Cullman County. His toolbox rattled in the truck bed, filled with the instruments of his trade as a traveling mechanic, wrenches worn smooth by years of use, oil-stained rags, and spare parts that could bring a dead tractor back to life. The radio crackled with country music, Waylon Jennings singing about mamas and cowboys, while golden September light filtered through the windshield. Marcus hummed along, his calloused hands steady on the steering wheel. He wore his usual work uniform, denim overalls over a faded red flannel shirt, steel-toed boots that had walked through countless barnyards, and a John Deere cap that had seen better days. Marcus lived alone in a small rental house on the outskirts of Cullman, a quiet man who preferred the company of engines to people. He'd grown up in Birmingham, but after his father died in a steel mill accident, he'd moved north seeking the simpler rhythms of rural life. The farmers knew him as honest and fair. He never overcharged for parts and always explained what needed fixing in plain English. This particular Saturday morning, he was headed to fix Walt Henderson's combine harvester. Walt had called the night before, his voice tight with worry. "Marcus, that damned machine is making a noise like a dying cat. Harvest starts Monday, and I can't afford to have her break down now." The Henderson farm sat at the end of a winding dirt road, bordered by tall pine trees and fields of cotton ready for picking. As Marcus pulled into the farmyard, he noticed Walt's wife, Betty, hanging laundry on the line. She waved, and he tipped his cap in response. The morning was peaceful, ordinary, the kind that would later be remembered for its very normalcy. Marcus parked beside the old red barn and grabbed his toolbox. The combine sat nearby, a massive green machine that looked like a mechanical monster against the backdrop of white cotton fields. He spent the next 3 hours working on the engine, the familiar rhythm of diagnosis and repair soothing his mind. Walt brought him sweet tea and watched him work, both men comfortable in their shared silence. Walt Henderson was a third-generation farmer, respected throughout the county for his hard work and fair dealing. His family had weathered the Depression by helping neighbors, and Walt continued that tradition. But lately, financial pressures had been mounting. The farm equipment was aging, and the bank had been asking pointed questions about loan payments. As Marcus worked, he noticed something unusual. Inside the barn, partially hidden behind stacks of feed, were cattle branding irons that didn't match the Henderson family brand. Marcus knew every brand in the county. It was part of his job to work on the equipment that maintained them. These irons bore markings from the Patterson Ranch 15 miles north, and the Morrison spread to the east. By noon, the job was finished. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and accepted payment. $60 cash, standard for a Saturday house call. But as he loaded his tools back into the truck, his mind kept returning to those branding irons. Walt Henderson didn't deal in cattle from other ranches, and there was no good reason for him to have their branding equipment. Marcus said his goodbyes and drove away from the Henderson farm. Betty Henderson would later tell police she watched his red pickup disappear down the dirt road at exactly 12:30 p.m. What she wouldn't tell them for years was the conversation she overheard between Marcus and her husband just before he left. "Mr. Henderson," Marcus had said quietly, "those branding irons in your barn, that's not something I can pretend I didn't see." That was the last time anyone saw Marcus Thompson alive. When Marcus failed to show up for his regular Sunday dinner at May's Diner in town, the waitress at Carroll noticed immediately. Marcus had eaten the same meal, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, every Sunday for 2 years. His absence felt wrong, like a missing note in a familiar song. Carol Williams had been serving food at May's Diner for 15 years, and she prided herself on knowing her customers. Marcus always arrived at exactly 1 p.m., sat in the corner booth facing the door, and left a 50-cent tip on his $2.75 meal. He was polite but quiet, the kind of man who spoke when spoken to, but never initiated conversation. By Monday morning, when Marcus didn't answer his phone or respond to knocks on his door, concern turned to alarm. His landlord, Mr. Jameson, found Marcus's house unlocked, his tools scattered on the kitchen table as if he'd been planning to work on them. His bed was unmade, coffee still sat in the pot, and his wallet lay on the dresser, everything suggesting he'd simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The Cullman County Sheriff's Department opened a missing person case on Tuesday, September 18, 1979. Sheriff Robert Clayton, a heavy-set man with a grey mustache who'd served the county for 15 years, initially treated Marcus's disappearance as a routine matter. "Young men sometimes get restless," he told Marcus's worried customers. "Probably went to Birmingham to visit family or maybe found work in the oil fields down in Texas." But as days turned to weeks, it became clear this wasn't a case of wanderlust. Marcus had no family left in Birmingham. His mother had died 3 years earlier, and he was an only child. His bank account remained untouched, his truck was never found, and none of the neighboring counties reported anyone matching his description. The search effort was led by Walt Henderson, who felt responsible since Marcus had disappeared after working on his farm. Walt organized search parties of local farmers and their sons, men who knew every back road and creek bed in the county. They combed through woods and fields, dragged ponds, and checked abandoned buildings. The searchers worked in the crisp October air, their breath visible in the morning cold, hoping to find any trace of the missing mechanic. Walt Henderson seemed genuinely distressed by Marcus's disappearance. He offered a $500 reward, a substantial sum in 1979, for any information leading to Marcus's whereabouts. He spoke to newspaper reporters about what a good man Marcus was, how reliable and trustworthy. "That boy was like family to us," Walt told the Cullman Tribune. He'd worked on our equipment for 2 years, never once gave us cause for complaint. Carol from May's Diner posted flyers throughout town, Marcus's driver's license photo staring out from telephone poles and grocery store bulletin boards. The image showed a serious young man with dark hair and honest eyes, the kind of face that belonged in small-town America. Under the photo, in Carol's careful handwriting, "Missing, Marcus Thompson, age 23, last seen, September 15th. If you have any information, please contact Cullman County Sheriff's Department." As autumn deepened into winter, the search parties grew smaller. Life in Cullman County continued its steady rhythm. Cotton was harvested, corn was sold at market, and people began preparing for the holidays. Marcus's disappearance became a sad mystery that people discussed in hushed tones at the hardware store and after church services. The theories multiplied with each passing week. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, was convinced Marcus had gotten mixed up with bootleggers operating in the backwoods. "That boy was too trusting," she'd say, shaking her grey head. "Somebody probably asked him to fix something in the woods and then robbed him." Others believed Marcus had simply decided to start over somewhere else. Tom Wilson, who owned the auto parts store, argued that Marcus was a loner who might have grown tired of small-town life. "Wouldn't be the first young man to want to see the world," Tom would say when the subject came up. But those who knew Marcus best, Carol from the diner, his landlord, his regular customers, never believed he'd left voluntarily. Marcus was a creature of habit, reliable as sunrise. He wouldn't have abandoned his tools, his customers, or his quiet life without a word. Sheriff Clayton faced mounting pressure from the community, but his resources were limited. The county had only 3 full-time deputies, and they were already stretched thin dealing with cattle theft, domestic disputes, and the occasional break-in. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation was contacted, but without evidence of foul play, they couldn't justify a major investigation. By Christmas of 1979, the active search for Marcus Thompson had effectively ended. His missing person file was placed in a folder that grew thicker with each passing year as periodic tips came in, always false leads, mistaken identities, or well-meaning but misguided speculation. Cullman County, Alabama, 1980-2000. What happens to a community when someone simply vanishes? Marcus Thompson's disappearance left ripples that spread far beyond his small circle of acquaintances, touching lives in ways both obvious and subtle. Carol Williams never stopped setting aside a portion of Sunday's meatloaf, just in case Marcus walked through the diner's door. For months after his disappearance, she would glance up hopefully whenever the bell above the entrance chimed. The corner booth where Marcus used to sit remained perpetually empty in her mind, even when occupied by other customers. In 1982, Carol finally removed Marcus's missing person flyer from the diner's bulletin board, not because she'd given up hope, but because the paper had faded to yellow and the tape had lost its adhesive. She folded the flyer carefully and kept it in her purse, a talisman of faith that someday there would be answers. Walt Henderson continued farming, but neighbors noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. The gregarious man who had once been the life of every church social and town meeting became increasingly withdrawn. His wife Betty mentioned to friends that Walt had trouble sleeping, often pacing the house at night or sitting on the front porch until dawn. The Henderson farm prospered during the 1980s, despite the agricultural recession that hurt many of their neighbors. Walt seemed to have an uncanny ability to anticipate market fluctuations and always had cash on hand for equipment upgrades and land purchases. When asked about his success, he credited hard work and careful planning, though some neighbors whispered about his surprisingly good fortune. In 1985, the cattle theft ring that had been plaguing the region was finally broken up by a joint operation between Alabama and Tennessee law enforcement. 7 men were arrested, including 2 from neighboring counties. The investigation revealed a sophisticated operation that had been stealing and rebranding cattle for nearly a decade, but the ringleaders were never identified. Sheriff Clayton retired in 1988, and his replacement, Sheriff Janet Morrison, brought fresh eyes to old cases. She reopened the Marcus Thompson file in 1989, conducting new interviews with anyone who had known the missing mechanic. The reinvestigation yielded nothing concrete, but it reminded the community that some questions remained unanswered. Marcus's rental house was eventually sold to a young couple from Birmingham who had no knowledge of its history. They painted the rooms bright colors and planted a garden in the backyard, unknowingly erasing the last physical traces of the missing mechanic's quiet life. The auto parts store that Tom Wilson owned became an unofficial memorial to Marcus. Tom kept Marcus's favorite tools on display, not for sale, but as a reminder of the honest young man who had simply vanished. Customers would sometimes ask about the tools, and Tom would tell Marcus's story to anyone who would listen. In 1995, Walt Henderson suffered a massive heart attack while working in his fields. He was found by his hired hand, lying unconscious next to his tractor on a hot July afternoon. As paramedics loaded him into the ambulance, Walt regained consciousness briefly and spoke a single word: Marcus. Betty Henderson dismissed it as delirium brought on by the heart attack, but the paramedic who heard it, Danny Torres, never forgot the fear in Walt's eyes when he spoke that name. Walt recovered from the heart attack but was never the same. His health remained fragile, and he was forced to reduce his farming operations. The man who had once been one of the county's most successful farmers became increasingly dependent on his wife and hired help. During the 1990s, as the region experienced economic growth, developers began purchasing farmland for residential subdivisions. Several offers were made for the Henderson property, all of which Walt rejected despite the substantial sums involved. "This land stays in the family," he would tell Betty. "So it's got to stay in the family." Walt Henderson died in his sleep on March 3, 2000, at the age of 68. His funeral was well attended, a testament to the respect he had earned in the community, despite his increasingly reclusive nature in later years. Betty inherited the farm, but found herself unable to manage it alone. The farm sat empty for 3 years, while Betty attempted to decide its fate. She couldn't bring herself to sell it to developers, but she also couldn't return to live in the house where she and Walt had shared 43 years of marriage. The weight of memories, both spoken and unspoken, made the property feel haunted by more than just the passage of time. In 2003, Betty finally made the decision to sell. She chose Jake Morrison, a contractor with a reputation for preserving historical properties, partly because he promised to restore the old farmhouse rather than demolish it. What she didn't tell Jake was that she chose him primarily because he shared a last name with Sheriff Morrison, the officer who had tried so hard to find answers about Marcus Thompson. Betty Henderson moved to Florida to live with her daughter, carrying with her a lifetime of secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. She often wondered if she should have spoken up decades earlier, but the time for truth-telling seemed to have passed with her husband's death. What Betty didn't know was that some secrets have a way of surfacing on their own, buried truth seeking light, like seeds, waiting for the right season to grow. Cullman County, Alabama, October 3, 2003. Jake Morrison had restored dozens of old properties throughout northern Alabama, but the Henderson farm presented unique challenges. The house had been abandoned for 3 years, and vegetation had begun reclaiming the structures. Kudzu vines wrapped around the barn like green fingers, and the tin roof had developed multiple leaks that had damaged the interior. Jake was a methodical man who believed in understanding a property's history before beginning restoration. He'd spent weeks researching the Henderson family, learning about their 3 generations of farming and Walt's reputation as a pillar of the community. What he couldn't understand was why such a successful farm had been allowed to deteriorate so dramatically. The morning of October 3rd was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made even abandoned buildings look picturesque. Jake had decided to start with the barn, clearing out decades of accumulated debris before assessing the structural integrity of the building. The barn was a cathedral of rural history, rusted farm equipment, stacks of rotting lumber, and layers of detritus that told the story of American agriculture from the 1940s through the 1990s. Jake worked systematically, separating salvageable materials from trash. The air was thick with dust and the sweet smell of decay. He was deep in the barn's shadowy interior when his crowbar struck something unexpected beneath a pile of moldy feed sacks. The resistance was different from wood or metal, something solid but yielding, like a container filled with heavy objects. The red toolbox was buried under years of debris, its paint faded to rust brown. At first, Jake thought it was just another piece of abandoned farm equipment, but as he cleared away the rotting sacks and pulled the box into the light, he realized this was something different entirely. The tools inside were clearly not farm implements. Socket wrenches, precision instruments, and specialty equipment spoke of a different kind of work entirely. Jake had enough mechanical knowledge to recognize quality tools when he saw them, and these were the instruments of a professional mechanic. Wrapped in an oiled cloth at the bottom of the box were personal items that made Jake's blood run cold: a driver's license and social security card belonging to Marcus Thompson, along with a small notebook filled with handwritten records of mechanical work performed throughout Cullman County. Jake Morrison had never heard of Marcus Thompson, but finding personal documents buried in a barn struck him as deeply wrong. He called the Cullman County Sheriff's Department immediately, and within an hour, Deputy Sarah Mitchell arrived at the property. Sarah was 34 years old, one of the new generation of law enforcement officers who brought modern investigative techniques to rural police work. She had heard stories about the missing mechanic from older officers, but the case had been inactive for so long that most people assumed Marcus Thompson had simply left town and started over somewhere else. As she examined the toolbox, Sarah felt the familiar tingle that came with discovering important evidence. The tools were well maintained, organized with the care of a professional tradesman. This wasn't random junk. Someone had deliberately buried this box in the barn, and they had done so with the intention of keeping it hidden permanently. Sarah photographed everything in place before disturbing the scene, then carefully removed each item from the toolbox. The notebook was particularly intriguing. It contained detailed records of work performed on dozens of vehicles and pieces of equipment throughout 1979, with the last entry dated September 14th, just one day before Marcus's disappearance. The final entry was for work performed on a combine harvester at the Henderson farm. Below it, in Marcus's careful handwriting, was a note that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Found branding irons in barn, Patterson, Morrison, Jackson ranches. Doesn't match WH. Operations. Question about cattle source. Sarah called the station and asked the dispatcher to pull the old file on Marcus Thompson. 20 minutes later, she had confirmation. Missing person case from 1979, never solved. The original investigating officer, Sheriff Clayton Truss, had retired years ago, but the file remained open. The discovery of Marcus's toolbox transformed the case from a cold missing person report to an active criminal investigation. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation was contacted immediately, and by afternoon the Henderson farm was crawling with forensic specialists. Agent Linda Foster arrived from Birmingham that evening, bringing with her 20 years of experience in complex criminal cases. She was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense focus that made people take notice when she spoke. Foster treated the barn as a potential crime scene, establishing a perimeter and beginning a systematic search for additional evidence. What she found beneath the spot where the toolbox had been buried sent shockwaves through the investigation. Fragments of fabric, preserved by the cool, dry conditions inside the barn, matched the description of the red flannel shirt Marcus had been wearing the day he disappeared. More importantly, the fabric showed signs of damage consistent with violent struggle, tears and stains that suggested something terrible had happened in this barn 24 years earlier. The feed sacks covering the toolbox bore date stamps from late 1979 and early 1980, confirming that the burial had occurred shortly after Marcus's disappearance. Someone with access to the Henderson barn had hidden this evidence deliberately and effectively, choosing a location where it might never be discovered. As news of the discovery spread through Cullman County, old memories stirred and whispered conversations resumed. People who had been children in 1979 were now adults with families of their own. Some remembered their parents talking about the missing mechanic in hushed tones, conversations that stopped abruptly when children entered the room. The case that had gone cold for nearly a quarter century was suddenly alive again, and someone in Cullman County was about to face questions they'd been avoiding for 24 years. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, as they often do in cases that have remained cold for decades. Mary Ellen Sinclair had been Walt Henderson's nearest neighbor in 1979, living in a small house across the county road from the farm. Now 78 and residing in Sunset Manor, assisted living facility in Decatur, Mary Ellen heard about the discovery on the evening news. For 24 years, Mary Ellen had carried a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. She had convinced herself that speaking up would accomplish nothing. The guilty party was dead, and the truth would only bring pain to innocent family members. But seeing Marcus Thompson's tools displayed on the television screen, hearing the reporter describe the fabric fragments found buried with them, Mary Ellen knew she could no longer remain silent. Agent Foster drove to Decatur on a grey November morning to interview the elderly woman. Mary Ellen sat in the facility's common room, her arthritis-gnarled hands folded in her lap, her memory sharp despite her age. "I've carried this secret for 24 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Figured I'd take it to my grave, but I can't bear the thought of that young man's people never knowing what happened." What Mary Ellen revealed shattered the carefully constructed silence that had protected a terrible truth for decades. On the evening of September 15, 1979, Mary Ellen had been working in her vegetable garden when she heard raised voices from the Henderson barn. The sound carried clearly across the quiet farmyard. Two men arguing, their voices growing more heated with each exchange. Through the trees, she could see Walt Henderson gesticulating angrily at someone she assumed was Marcus Thompson, though she couldn't see the second person clearly from her position. Mary Ellen had always prided herself on minding her own business, but something about the intensity of the argument compelled her to listen. "You can't tell nobody about this," Walt's voice carried across the quiet farmyard. "My family will be ruined. Everything we've worked for will be gone." Marcus's response was quieter, but Mary Ellen could hear the determination in his voice. "Mr. Henderson, I can't pretend I didn't see what I saw. Those cattle don't belong to you, and you know it." Mary Ellen had crept closer to her property line, hidden by the row of pine trees that bordered both properties. What she witnessed next would haunt her for the rest of her life. Marcus Thompson emerged from the barn, his toolbox in one hand, his face pale but resolute. He walked toward his red pickup truck with the measured pace of a man who had made a difficult decision and intended to follow through with it. Walt Henderson followed, pleading now rather than threatening. "Marcus, please, I can explain everything." "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," Marcus replied, setting his toolbox in the truck bed. "You've been stealing cattle and rebranding them. That's why you have those irons from other ranches. That's why you always seem to have money when other farmers are struggling." Walt's demeanor changed instantly. The pleading stopped, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You can't prove anything. Who's going to believe a drifter mechanic over a Henderson?" Marcus turned to face Walt, his young face etched with the kind of moral certainty that comes from a clear conscience. "I don't need anyone to believe me. The evidence speaks for itself. Those branding irons, the cattle in your back pasture that don't match your herd records, it's all there for anyone who knows what to look for." What happened next occurred so quickly that Mary Ellen almost missed it. Walt Henderson grabbed a heavy wrench from Marcus's toolbox and struck the young man from behind. Marcus collapsed instantly, his body crumpling to the ground like a marionette with cut strings. Mary Ellen had stumbled backward, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a scream. She ran to her house and locked the doors, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Through her kitchen window, she watched Walt Henderson drag Marcus's unconscious form toward the barn. For the next several hours, Mary Ellen observed lights moving around the Henderson property. She saw Walt using his tractor to dig in the back corner of the cotton field, working by headlight until nearly dawn. When the sun rose, everything appeared normal, except for a patch of freshly turned earth that would soon be planted with cotton, and Marcus Thompson was gone forever. "Why didn't you call the police?" Agent Foster asked gently. Mary Ellen's eyes filled with tears. Walt Henderson was the most respected man in this county. His family had farmed this land for 3 generations. Who would have believed an old widow woman over someone like him? Besides, she paused, her voice breaking, Walt's boy Tommy was only 16 then. If his daddy went to prison, what would happen to that family? The investigation that followed Mary Ellen's confession was swift and thorough. Ground-penetrating radar located the burial site exactly where she had described, beneath what had once been the back corner of Walt Henderson's cotton field. The cotton had been harvested decades ago, and the field had returned to wilderness, but the disturbed earth remained detectable to modern technology. Marcus Thompson's remains were found, along with fragments of his red pickup truck, which had been dismantled and buried nearby. The truck's engine block bore Marcus's name etched into the metal, a precaution he had taken to prevent theft of his tools and vehicle. The motive for the murder became clear as investigators pieced together the evidence. Walt Henderson had been involved in a sophisticated cattle rustling operation that extended across 3 counties. The operation worked by stealing cattle from large ranches, where a few missing animals might not be noticed, then rebranding them and selling them through legitimate cattle markets. Marcus Thompson, with his mechanical knowledge and honest nature, had recognized the significance of the branding irons he'd discovered in Walt's barn. His notebook contained detailed observations about cattle he'd seen on the Henderson property that didn't match Walt's registered brand, evidence that would have exposed the entire operation. Betty Henderson, now 81 and living with her daughter in Tampa, provided the final piece of the puzzle when investigators contacted her. Walt was a good man who made bad choices, she said, her voice heavy with decades of hidden guilt. So after the recession nearly broke us in the 70s, he got desperate. He thought rustling a few head of cattle wouldn't hurt nobody. Big ranchers had so many they'd never miss them. Betty had known about her husband's illegal activities, but had convinced herself they were harmless. She never suspected murder until the day Marcus disappeared. Walt came home that night covered in dirt, his clothes torn. He told me Marcus had decided to leave town sudden-like, but I knew something terrible had happened. Walt was never the same after that day. The guilt ate at him like cancer until the day he died. The cattle rustling ring that Walt Henderson had belonged to was eventually exposed through the Marcus Thompson investigation. 3 other men, all now elderly, were arrested and charged with various crimes related to the operation. The ringleaders had died years earlier, taking their secrets to the grave, but the truth about their activities finally came to light. Marcus Thompson was laid to rest in Cullman County Cemetery on a cold December morning in 2003, 24 years after his murder. The funeral was attended by people who had never met him, but felt connected to his story. Mechanics who had inherited his customers, farmers who remembered his honest work, and investigators who had spent months seeking justice for a man killed simply for being too honest to look the other way. Carol Williams from May's Diner served as a pallbearer, finally able to say goodbye to the quiet young man who had eaten meatloaf and mashed potatoes at her corner booth every Sunday. She had kept his missing person flyer in her purse for 24 years, and she placed it in his casket before the burial. The case of Marcus Thompson's disappearance officially closed with his burial, but the questions it raised about moral courage, community silence, and the price of speaking truth continued to resonate throughout Cullman County. People began to wonder what other secrets might be buried beneath the quiet surface of small-town life, and whether they would have the courage to speak up if faced with the same choice that had cost Marcus Thompson his life. In the end, Marcus Thompson's story became more than just a tale of crime and punishment. It became a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers in the shadows, but from the respected members of the community who believe their position protects them from the consequences of their actions. And it served as a testament to the power of truth, which has a way of surfacing even when buried under decades of silence and the weight of community secrets.